My name is Rachel Whitman, and I used to believe that honesty was the best policy. That was before I met Judith Cross, the woman who turned my medical condition into a weapon against me, and before I learned that sometimes the only way to fight a monster is to become something more dangerous than they ever imagined. It started on a Tuesday morning in September, when the migraine hit like a freight train during our quarterly budget review meeting. I was sitting in Conference Room B at Pinnacle Axis, our mid-sized financial services firm in downtown Boston, when the fluorescent lights above began their familiar assault on my visual cortex. The pain started as a dull throb behind my left eye, then exploded into a symphony of agony that made my vision blur and my stomach lurch. I'd been dealing with chronic migraines for 8 years, ever since a car accident left me with what my neurologist called post-traumatic migraine syndrome. The triggers were predictable: stress, certain foods, weather changes, and most devastatingly, the harsh fluorescent lighting that bathed our office in its merciless white glow. I'd learned to manage them with medication, dark rooms, and careful planning. But sometimes they still broke through my defenses like a burglar in the night. Rachel, are you following the variance analysis? Brandon Keller, my direct supervisor, was looking at me with concern as I pressed my palm against my temple. I'm sorry, I need to step out for a moment, I managed to whisper, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. I stumbled back to my cubicle, a beige-walled prison that I decorated with photos of my sister's kids and a small succulent that somehow managed to survive under the artificial lighting. The pain was building, each pulse of the fluorescent bulbs above sending fresh waves of agony through my skull. I fumbled for my emergency medication in my desk drawer, dry swallowing 2 pills while trying to breathe through the nausea. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I couldn't keep living like this. Couldn't keep pretending that I was fine when the very environment I worked in was slowly destroying me. I needed help, and I needed it officially. I spent the next week gathering documentation, medical records from Dr. Patricia Henley, my neurologist, detailing my condition and its triggers, research studies on fluorescent lighting and migraine disorders, a detailed plan for reasonable accommodations that would allow me to work from home 2 days per week, reducing my exposure to the office lighting while maintaining my full productivity. The email I sent to HR was professional, thorough, and heartbreaking to write. I attached every piece of documentation, explained my condition in clinical detail, and requested a meeting to discuss accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act. I hit send on a Friday afternoon, hoping that by Monday I'd have a response that would change my life for the better. Judith Cross's reply came on Tuesday morning, and it was a masterpiece of corporate cruelty disguised as policy adherence. Meeting Whitman, thank you for your inquiry regarding workplace accommodations. After reviewing your request with our legal team, we have determined that remote work arrangements are not consistent with the collaborative nature of your position. We encourage you to explore other options for managing your personal health concerns that do not require modifications to your work schedule or location. Please schedule a meeting with your supervisor to discuss performance expectations moving forward. I read the email 3 times, each pass making my hands shake a little more. There was no mention of the ADA, no acknowledgement of my medical documentation, no indication that they had even considered my request seriously. But there was something else in the tone, something that made my stomach drop. The phrase, performance expectations, felt like a threat wrapped in HR speak. Brandon was sympathetic when I showed him the email, but he was also clearly uncomfortable. Look, Rachel, I know you're dealing with a lot, but Judith runs a tight ship. Maybe we can work something out informally. You know, if you're having a bad day, just let me know and we can adjust your schedule. It was kindness, but it wasn't protection. Informal arrangements could disappear as quickly as they were made, and I needed something more solid than Brandon's goodwill to build my future on. That's when the meeting started. The first one was ostensibly about my development opportunities. Judith scheduled it for 10 a.m. on a Wednesday. In Conference Room A, which had the brightest fluorescent lighting in the building, I arrived with sunglasses in my purse and a full dose of preventive medication already in my system. Judith Cross was a woman who wore authority like expensive perfume, subtle but unmistakable. She was in her early 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and the kind of posture that suggested she'd never had a doubt about anything in her life. Her office was a shrine to corporate efficiency, with motivational posters about excellence and teamwork that felt more like warnings than inspiration. "Rachel, I wanted to touch base about your recent email," she began, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who'd learned to sound caring without actually feeling it. "I'm concerned about your commitment to your role here at Pinnacle Axis." "I'm very committed to my work," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing pain behind my eyes. "That's why I'm seeking accommodations that will allow me to perform at my best. I understand you believe you have certain needs." Judith continued, emphasizing the word needs as if it were something distasteful. "But we have to consider the impact on team cohesion, on productivity, on the precedent we set for other employees who might also develop preferences for working from home." She was being careful with her words, dancing around the legal language that would make her statements actionable. But the message was clear: my medical condition was an inconvenience. My request was unreasonable, and I needed to adjust my expectations accordingly. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. By the end, I was fighting not to vomit from the pain, and Judith was scheduling a follow-up for the next week. As I left, she handed me a copy of the employee handbook with certain sections highlighted in yellow: the attendance policy, the performance review process, and the section on maintaining professional standards. I made it to the bathroom before I threw up. That evening, I called my sister Maya, who lived in Portland with her husband and 2 kids. Maya was a paralegal at a personal injury firm, and she'd always been the practical one in our family. "Rachel, this sounds like retaliation," she said after I told her about the meeting. "You made a legal request, and now they're creating a paper trail to justify getting rid of you. You need to document everything." I created a folder on my personal laptop that night and titled it Judith Retaliation. It felt dramatic, paranoid even, but Maya was right. I needed to protect myself, and that meant treating every interaction like it might end up in front of a judge. The second meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, this time in Judith's office. The agenda was communication strategies, but the real purpose became clear within the first 5 minutes. "I've been reviewing your recent work output, Rachel, and I'm seeing some concerning patterns," Judith said, pulling out a manila folder thick with printed emails. "Your response times have been slower than usual, and I've noticed you've been leaving early on several occasions. I've been having more frequent migraines, which is why I requested accommodations," I explained, trying to keep my voice level. "And I've never left early without completing my work or getting approval from Brandon." "I understand you have health concerns," Judith replied, "but we need to ensure that these personal issues don't impact your professional obligations. I'm going to need you to provide daily status reports for the next month, just so we can monitor your productivity more closely." Daily status reports. For someone who'd been at the company for 3 years with consistently excellent performance reviews, it was humiliating. It was also suspicious timing, less than 2 weeks after my accommodation request. "Is this directly related to my ADA request?" I asked, the question hanging in the air like smoke. Judith's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "This is related to ensuring that all employees meet their performance obligations. If you have concerns about the process, you're welcome to file a grievance through the appropriate channels." I filed the grievance that afternoon, knowing it would go directly to Judith Cross, Head of Human Resources. The response came back within 48 hours. "Grievance reviewed and found to be without merit. Performance monitoring will continue as scheduled." That's when I realized I wasn't just fighting for accommodations anymore. I was fighting for my professional survival against someone who had turned cruelty into a corporate art form. The daily reports were a special kind of torture. Every morning, I had to document every task I completed, every email I sent, every phone call I made. Every evening, I had to summarize my accomplishments and plan for the next day. It was busy work designed to consume time and create opportunities for criticism. Judith found plenty to criticize. My reports were too detailed 1 week, lacking specificity the next. My task prioritization was inconsistent with team goals. My communication style was too informal in some instances, unnecessarily formal in others. Meanwhile, my migraines were getting worse. The stress of constant scrutiny, combined with the fluorescent lighting that I was spending more time under due to the increased documentation requirements, was creating a vicious cycle. I was taking more sick days, which gave Judith more ammunition for her performance concerns. 3 weeks into the monitoring period, I had what I later learned was called a status migrainous, a migraine that lasted for more than 72 hours straight. I spent a weekend in the emergency room, hooked up to IV fluids and pain medication, begging doctors to make it stop. I returned to work on Monday with a doctor's note recommending immediate workplace accommodations and a formal letter from my neurologist explaining that my condition was worsening due to environmental factors. I hand-delivered both documents to Judith's office, hoping that the severity of my situation would finally break through her wall of corporate indifference. Instead, she scheduled another meeting. "Rachel, I'm concerned about your attendance pattern," she said, the medical documentation sitting unopened on her desk. 3 sick days in the past month, plus the partial day you left early for your ER visit. We need to discuss whether your current role is the right fit for your PC situation. My situation is a recognized disability under federal law, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. I'm requesting reasonable accommodations that would allow me to do my job effectively. These accommodations are supported by medical documentation and wouldn't create any undue hardship for the company. I understand you feel that way, Judith replied, but we have to consider what's best for the organization as a whole. Perhaps we should explore other options that might be more suitable for your needs. Other options: transfer to a lower-paying position, voluntary resignation, disability leave that would end my career at Pinnacle Axis. She was offering me ways to eliminate myself from the problem. I don't want other options, I said. I want to do my job, and I want the accommodations that federal law requires you to provide. Judith's smile was thin and sharp. We'll certainly continue to explore all possibilities. In the meantime, I need you to understand that your performance issues are becoming a serious concern. I'd hate for this to impact your employment status. There it was, the threat delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. I left that meeting knowing that I was going to be fired. It was just a matter of when and how. Judith was building a case, creating a paper trail that would justify my termination while providing legal cover for the company. She was good at her job, if her job was destroying people's lives while protecting corporate interests. That night, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine and my laptop, staring at the Judith retaliation folder that had grown to over 50 documents. I had emails, meeting notes, medical records, and a timeline that clearly showed the correlation between my accommodation request and the sudden concerns about my performance. I also had something else: rage. Pure, clean, focused rage that cut through the migraine fog like a laser. Judith Cross had made a critical error in judgment. She'd assumed that because I was sick, I was also weak. She'd mistaken my attempts at professionalism for submission. She'd confused my need for accommodations with an inability to fight back. She was about to learn how wrong she was. I spent the next morning researching employment attorneys who specialized in ADA cases. I found Esther Dalton, a partner at a firm that had successfully sued several major corporations for disability discrimination. Her bio mentioned that she'd grown up with a brother who had epilepsy, and she'd chosen her legal specialty after watching him face employment discrimination. I called her office at 9 a.m. "Ms. Dalton, my name is Rachel Whitman, and I believe I'm being retaliated against for requesting workplace accommodations under the ADA. I have extensive documentation, and I think I need help." "Tell me everything," she said, and I did. The consultation lasted 2 hours. Esther reviewed my documentation, asked pointed questions about company policy, and took detailed notes about every interaction with Judith. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and smiled. "Ms. Whitman, you've done excellent work documenting this case. What you're describing is a textbook example of disability discrimination and retaliation. The question is, how aggressive do you want to be in fighting it?" "I want to stop her from doing this to anyone else," I said. "And I want to make sure that what she's done to me has consequences." "Good," Esther said, "because I think we can do both." The first step was a formal complaint to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Esther filed it that afternoon, triggering an investigation that would require Pinnacle access to preserve all relevant documents and provide responses to federal investigators. The second step was strategic. Instead of immediately notifying Judith that I had legal representation, we decided to give her more rope to hang herself with. I would continue documenting our interactions, but now I had professional guidance on what to look for and how to protect myself. The third step was the most important. We started reaching out to other employees who might have faced similar treatment. It didn't take long to find them. Marcus Thompson had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes 2 years earlier. When he'd requested accommodations for managing his blood sugar, specifically permission to keep snacks at his desk and take short breaks to test his glucose levels, Judith had initially approved the request. But then she'd begun scheduling him for back-to-back meetings that made it impossible to maintain his testing schedule. And she'd assigned him to projects with tight deadlines that required him to work through lunch. Marcus had never connected these actions to his disability accommodation. He'd assumed he was just having a run of bad luck with scheduling. It wasn't until I showed him the pattern of my own experiences that he began to see the deliberate nature of Judith's actions. "She's been setting me up to fail," he said, his voice quiet with realization. "Every time I've had to step out of a meeting to test my blood sugar, she's made some comment about disrupting the flow or being prepared for commitments. I thought I was being too sensitive." Sarah Martinez had requested accommodations for her hearing impairment 6 months earlier. She'd asked for meeting notes to be distributed in advance and for important announcements to be followed up in writing. Judith had approved the requests, but then began scheduling impromptu meetings where critical information was discussed verbally, with no follow-up documentation. I kept missing important details, Sarah explained when I met with her at a coffee shop near our office. Then I'd get in trouble for not following instructions I'd never received. I started thinking maybe I wasn't cut out for this job. There were others. David Chen had been denied accommodations for his anxiety disorder. Lisa Rodriguez had been transferred to a less desirable position after requesting ergonomic adjustments for her back injury. In each case, Judith had used the same playbook: formal denial or approval, followed by subtle sabotage designed to make the employee's work life unbearable. Esther was thrilled when I brought her this information. "This isn't just your case anymore," she said. "This is a pattern of discriminatory behavior that affects multiple employees. We're looking at a potential class action lawsuit." But even as we built our case, Judith was escalating her campaign against me. The incident that finally pushed things over the edge happened on a Thursday morning in November. I was working late on a quarterly report when one of my migraines hit with unusual severity. The pain was so intense that I couldn't see clearly, and I was struggling not to vomit at my desk. I made it to the stairwell before I collapsed. Brandon found me there 20 minutes later, curled up on the concrete floor of the emergency exit, trying to breathe through the pain. He immediately called 911, but by the time the paramedics arrived, I was feeling well enough to refuse transport to the hospital. The next morning, I found an email from Judith waiting in my inbox. "Rachel, I'm concerned about yesterday's incident in the stairwell. Collapsing at work raises serious questions about your ability to perform your job safely. I'm requiring you to provide medical clearance from your doctor before returning to work. And we'll need to discuss whether your current role is appropriate given your health limitations." Medical clearance. She was forcing me to prove that I was healthy enough to work, the same work that was making me sick because she refused to provide reasonable accommodations. I forwarded the email to Esther, who called me within an hour. "This is it," she said. "This is where she's overplayed her hand. She's now directly linking your medical condition to your employment status, which is exactly what the ADA is designed to prevent. We're going to respond, and we're going to make it clear that her behavior stops now. The letter Esther sent to Pinnacle Access was a thing of beauty. It outlined my entire case, referenced the federal complaint that was already pending, and demanded immediate accommodations along with a cessation of all retaliatory behavior. It also mentioned that we were aware of other employees who had faced similar treatment and that we were prepared to expand our legal action accordingly. Most importantly, it put Judith and the company on notice that every action they took from that point forward would be scrutinized by federal investigators and potentially presented to a jury. I hand-delivered the letter to Judith's office on a Monday morning, watching her face as she read it. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely surprised. Then she looked angry. "I see you've decided to escalate this situation," she said, setting the letter down carefully. "I've decided to protect my rights," I replied. "I've also decided that I won't be quiet about what's happening here anymore." "That's unfortunate," Judith said. "I'd hoped we could resolve this professionally." Professionally would have been providing the accommodations I requested 8 months ago. I said, "What you've done instead is create a hostile work environment designed to force me out of my job. That ends now." Judith's smile was cold. "We'll see about that." But something had changed. The letter had shifted the power dynamic, and Judith knew it. She couldn't continue her campaign of subtle harassment now that it was being documented by federal investigators and employment attorneys. Every email, every meeting, every interaction was potentially evidence in a lawsuit that could cost the company millions of dollars. Instead, she tried a different approach. The next day, I received a call from Tom Morrison, the company's general counsel. He wanted to meet to discuss resolving this matter amicably. "Ms. Whitman, I've reviewed your situation, and I think there may have been some misunderstandings," he said when we met in his office. "We're prepared to offer you a generous severance package and a positive reference, which would allow you to transition to a new position that might be better suited to your needs. Are you also prepared to provide the accommodations I requested?" I asked. "We think a fresh start might be better for everyone involved," he replied, not answering my question. "What you're offering is a bribe to make me go away quietly," I said. "What I'm asking for is compliance with federal law. Those aren't equivalent." Tom's expression hardened. "I'm trying to help you here, Rachel. This doesn't have to become a public battle that damages your reputation and career prospects." "My reputation and career prospects are already being damaged," I replied. "The difference is that now I have legal protection and documentation of what's been happening." The meeting ended with no agreement, but I could see the concern in Tom's eyes. The company was starting to understand that this wasn't going to be resolved with a quiet payout and a non-disclosure agreement. A week later, EEOC investigators arrived at Pinnacle Access for their formal investigation. They interviewed me, along with Marcus, Sarah, and several other employees who had come forward with similar stories. They also interviewed Judith, Brandon, and other members of management. I wasn't privy to those interviews, but I could see their impact on the office dynamics. Judith was no longer the untouchable queen of HR. She was a liability, and everyone knew it. The investigation also uncovered something that none of us had expected. Judith had been systematically deleting emails related to accommodation requests. The IT department had been instructed to clean up old files in the HR system, but the timing corresponded exactly with the period when multiple employees had made ADA requests. Destruction of evidence in a federal investigation was a serious crime, and it transformed our civil case into something much larger. "She's finished," Esther told me after learning about the deleted emails. No company can afford to keep an employee who destroys evidence in a federal investigation, especially when that evidence relates to disability discrimination. But Judith wasn't going down without a fight. In her final desperate move, she tried to turn the investigation against me. She filed a complaint with the company's ethics hotline, claiming that I had been soliciting confidential information from coworkers and attempting to organize a coordinated attack on company leadership. The ethics investigation lasted exactly 4 days. The company's external law firm, brought in to avoid conflicts of interest, quickly determined that my actions were protected under federal whistleblower statutes. Not only was I not guilty of any ethical violations, but any retaliation for my cooperation with the EEOC investigation would constitute additional federal crimes. The recommendation from the law firm was clear. Judith Cross needed to be terminated immediately, and the company needed to implement comprehensive policy changes to prevent similar incidents in the future. Judith was fired on a Tuesday afternoon in January. I wasn't there to see it happen. I was working from home 2 days a week, as part of the accommodations that had finally been approved, but the news spread through the office like wildfire. Brandon called me that evening to let me know what had happened. "She's gone," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and disbelief. Security escorted her out this afternoon. Tom Morrison made an announcement to the whole company about changes in HR leadership and recommitment to inclusive workplace policies. "How do you feel about it?" I asked. "Honestly, I feel like I should have stood up for you earlier," he said. "I knew what she was doing wasn't right, but I didn't want to rock the boat. I'm sorry. Rachel." The apology meant something, but it also highlighted one of the most frustrating aspects of workplace discrimination: the number of people who see it happening and choose to stay silent rather than risk their own comfort. The financial settlement came through 3 months later. Pinnacle Access agreed to pay $2.3 million to resolve the class action lawsuit, with individual payments to each affected employee based on the severity of their cases. My portion was enough to provide financial security for several years, but more importantly, the settlement included comprehensive policy changes that would protect future employees from facing similar discrimination. The company also agreed to mandatory training for all managers on ADA compliance and disability awareness. They implemented new procedures for accommodation requests, including independent review processes and strict documentation requirements. They created an ombudsman position to handle disability-related concerns, reporting directly to the CEO rather than through HR. But the most significant change was cultural. The investigation had exposed the toxic environment that Judith had created, and her termination sent a clear message that discriminatory behavior would not be tolerated. Several other employees came forward with their own stories of unfair treatment, leading to additional policy changes and personnel decisions. I stayed at Pinnacle Access for another year, working under the accommodations that had been approved as part of the settlement. The 2 days per week of remote work made an enormous difference in my health and productivity. My migraines became more manageable, and I was able to focus on my job without the constant stress of fighting for basic respect. But I also knew that my time there was limited. The settlement had given me financial freedom, and I wanted to use it to help other people who were facing similar struggles. I started Access Wellness Solutions on a Saturday morning in March, working from my kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee. The name was a deliberate choice. I wanted to honor the place where I'd learned to fight back, while also creating something positive from the experience. The company started as a consultation service, helping employees navigate accommodation requests and understand their rights under the ADA. But it quickly expanded to include resources for mental health support, legal referrals, and advocacy training. The first client was Marcus Thompson, who was facing new challenges at a different company. The second was Sarah Martinez, who had been promoted to a management position and wanted to ensure that her team members never faced the kind of discrimination we'd experienced. Within 6 months, Access Wellness Solutions had helped over 50 employees secure appropriate accommodations and had provided training to a dozen companies on disability inclusion. The work was meaningful in a way that auditing financial reports had never been. And I found myself energized by the challenge of turning legal requirements into human dignity. I never saw Judith Cross again after her termination, but I heard through the professional grapevine that she had struggled to find another HR position. The circumstances of her firing had become known in the industry, and companies were reluctant to hire someone with a history of discrimination complaints. There was a part of me that felt sorry for her. Unemployment is difficult for anyone, and I didn't take pleasure in her professional downfall. But there was a larger part of me that recognized the justice in her situation. She had used her power to harm vulnerable people, and she was finally facing consequences for those actions. The real victory wasn't Judith's termination, though It was the policy changes that would protect future employees. It was the other companies that reached out to Access Wellness Solutions for training after hearing about our case. It was the emails I received from employees who had successfully secured accommodations after reading about our experience. Change is slow and difficult, but it's possible. Sometimes it takes someone willing to fight back, to document the discrimination, to risk their own comfort for the sake of others. Sometimes it takes someone who refuses to be quiet when they're told to accept unfair treatment. I learned that I could be that someone. My name is Rachel Whitman, and I used to believe that honesty was the best policy. Now I know that sometimes honesty needs to be backed up with documentation, legal representation, and the willingness to make powerful people uncomfortable. I still get migraines. I still work in fluorescent-lit offices sometimes, but I do it on my own terms now, with accommodations that allow me to be productive and healthy. I do it while helping other people secure the same rights and protections. And I do it knowing that Judith Cross is no longer in a position to hurt anyone else. The folder on my laptop is still there, labeled Judith Retaliation, but it's archived now. I keep it as a reminder of what's possible when someone decides to fight back against a system that seems designed to crush them. It's also a reminder that the most dangerous thing about people like Judith Cross isn't their individual cruelty. It's the way they make discrimination feel normal, acceptable, just part of how business is done. But business doesn't have to be done that way. People don't have to accept unfair treatment just because it comes from someone with authority. Federal laws exist to protect workers' rights, and those laws only work when people are willing to use them. I'm still using them every day through Access Wellness Solutions. I help people understand their rights and fight for fair treatment. It's work that grew directly out of my experience with Judith Cross, and in a strange way, I'm grateful for that experience. Not because I enjoyed being discriminated against, but because it taught me that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. It taught me that documentation and determination could overcome institutional power. It taught me that sometimes the best way to heal from being hurt is to prevent others from being hurt in the same way. Judith Cross thought she was teaching me a lesson about knowing my place, about accepting my limitations, about being grateful for whatever scraps of consideration she was willing to throw my way. Instead, she taught me how to fight, and I've been fighting ever since.